The night was darker than usual when we set foot in the quiet town of Antique. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the wind carried whisper that sent chills down our spines. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, listening. Our journey had begun, a trip to find the lost village that many claimed had vanished without trace. Some said it was swallowed by the forest, others believed it was cursed, and few whispered of creatures lurking in the shadows, guarding its secrets. I wasn't alone. Beside me was Luis, my childhood friend, who had heard of this place from his grandmother's stories. She had warned him never to go looking for it, but curiosity had its way of pulling people toward the unknown. Then there was Mara, a documentary filmmaker who had spent years collecting folklore from the farthest corners of the country. She believed there was more to the legends than just old stories meant to scare children. Rounding out our group was Tito Ramon, an old local guide who knew these mountains like the lines on his palms. His silence spoke louder than words, and the way he avoided our questions about the village only deepened the mystery. The path ahead was barely visible, swallowed by thick vines and towering trees. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground itself didn't want us there. Strange symbols were carved into tree trunks, their meanings lost to time. May babala yan, Tito Ramon muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. A warning. But he didn't say more. As we ventured deeper, an eerie silence settled around us. No birds. No crickets. Just the sound of our breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. Luis tried to lighten the mood, joking about how we might accidentally step into another realm. But his laughter was nervous, forced. Even he could feel it, the unseen eyes, the heavy presence in the air. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow between the trees, barely noticeable. A flicker of movement where there shouldn't have been any. Mara raised her camera, but the lens refused to focus. "Something's there," she whispered. Luis turned, shining his flashlight toward the spot. The beam flickered, struggled, then died. A gust of cold wind rushed past us, making the hairs on our arms stand. Tito Ramon took a step back, his expression unreadable. "Balik na tayo," he said firmly. We hesitated. We had come too far to turn back now. But before we could argue, a low, guttural sound issued from the shadows, a sound that didn't belong to any animal we knew. Mara's grip tightened on her camera. Luis swallowed hard. And me? In my heart pounded so loudly, was afraid whatever was out there could hear it, and then, just beyond the trees, something moved again. Closer this time. Watching. Waiting. We weren't alone. Luis gripped in my arm, his fingers ice cold. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Mara was still pointing her camera toward the trees, but the screen remained dark, as if whatever was out there refused to be captured. Tito Ramon, however, wasn't looking at the shadows. His eyes were locked on the ground, his brow furrowed deep in thought. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice lower than before. "Kung alam ko lang na dito talaga ang hanap nyo, hindi ko kayo dinala." His words sent another wave of unease through me. He had known something all along, hadn't he? But before I could ask, Luis suddenly stepped forward, shining his flashlight toward the trees. The light wavered, casting long, twisted shadows on the trunks. For a second, nothing moved. The forest was still, too still. Then a branch snapped, and the sound seemed to echo, stretching unnaturally through the air. The pulse pounded in my ears. Mara gasped. There, she pointed. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the light. It was barely visible, shrouded in darkness, but I could make out its shape, tall, unmoving, watching. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way we understood. Luis took a shaky step back. Tito Ramon. He started, but our guide held up a hand, his expression tense. Huwag kayong gagalaw. His voice was sharp, commanding. It was the first time he had spoken with such urgency. We obeyed. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. Then, slowly, the figure turned, no footsteps, no sound, just shifting into the darkness until it disappeared completely. The silence afterward was suffocating. We leave now, Tito Ramon said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Mara, always the curious one, shook her head. That was real, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. That wasn't just a story. I looked at Tito Ramon, hoping for an explanation, but he simply sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. Hindi ko dapat pinayagan to, he said, mostly to himself. Pero matitigas ang ulo nyo, kaya makinig na lang kayo. He turned to us, his gaze heavy. Hindi lahat ng baryo ay para sa tao. His words sent chills down my spine. Luis cleared his throat, trying to shake off the fear clinging to all of us. Ano ba talaga ang nangyari sa baryo? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Tito Ramon hesitated before answering. Matagal na yon, he finally said. Bago pa ako pinanganak. Ang sabi ng matatanda, may isang baryo dito sa bundok. Tahimik lang, malayo sa iba, pero may kakaiba sa kanila. Ang mga tao roon hindi sila tulad natin. And my skin prickled. Mara leaned in, hanging onto his every word. Ano ibig mong sabihin? Tito Ramon exhaled slowly. Sa umaga, parang normal lang. May mga bahay, may taniman, may mga bata pang naglalaro. Pero pagdating ng dilim, he paused, looking around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he lowered his voice. Walang ilaw sa mga bahay. Walang ingay. Walang tao. A shudder ran through me. Luis frowned. Nawala sila. Hindi sila nawala, Tito Ramon corrected. Nagbago lang. No one spoke after that. The weight of his words settled deep in my chest, an unsettling heaviness I couldn't shake. Then Mara, ever the skeptic, crossed her arms. But if no one ever saw them at night, how do we know they were really different? Tito Ramon's eyes darkened. Dahil may ilang nakakita. At wala nang nakabalik sa kanila. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, and suddenly, the air felt even colder. I glanced around, feeling that strange sensation again, that we weren't alone. Mara adjusted her camera, shaking her head. There has to be a logical explanation, she murmured. Luis let out a nervous chuckle. Yee! Then why is a flashlight acting weird? He clicked it on and off, but the beam flickered weakly, refusing to stay bright. The own flashlight sputtered. Then, the lights in our hands began to dim, as if something unseen was pulling the energy from them. Tito Ramon's face went pale. Tama na to, he said sharply. Kung gusto niyong mabuhay, bumalik na tayo. And that was when we heard it, a voice. A whisper carried Ila the wind. Not from behind us. Not from the trees. But right next to us. We spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing we could see. Louis' breath hitched, and I felt him grip on my sleeve. The whisper had been clear, too close. My skin prickled as I turned in my head slowly, scanning the darkness. The trees loomed, their twisted branches reaching like fingers. The flashlight in my trembling hand flickered again before going completely dark. Mara, still clutching her camera, tried to turn on her backup light. Nothing. The screen of her camera, which had been stuck in blackness earlier, suddenly flashed white for a split second, revealing something, a blurry, shifting shadow, before shutting off completely. Tito Ramon was already moving. Huwag na kayong magtanong. Umalis na tayo. His voice was sharper than before, almost desperate. Louis hesitated, his eyes darting back to the trees. Pero Tito, may nakita tayong baryo, di ba? Hindi lang to kwento. Tito Ramon spun to face him, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Hindi mo naintindihan. Kung ano man yung nakita mo, hindi tao yon. The weight of his words sent chill down my spine. Mara clenched her jaw. If they're not people, then what are they? Tito Ramon didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a handful of dried leaves from the ground and whispered something under his breath before scattering them into the wind. It was some kind of ritual, something old. The leaves twisted unnaturally as they fell, carried away an unseen force. Louis opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a sound tore through the silence, a low, rasping breath, like something struggling to inhale. It was coming from behind us. I turned in my head, heart hammering, but there was still nothing. Just trees and shadows. Yet, the feeling of being watched was unbearable now. Then Mara screamed. I spun to her just as she stumbled backward, her foot catching on a root. She landed hard on the ground, her camera slipping from her hands. I saw it, she gasped, voice shaking. Louis rushed to her side. Ano yon? Ano nakita mo? Mara's hands were trembling. Hindi ko alam pero may mukha. Hindi tao. A sharp snap echoed from the trees, followed Ila rustling. The whispering started again, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was several, layered over each other, murmuring in a language none of us recognized. I grabbed Mara's camera, my fingers shaking as I fumbled to turn it on. The screen remained black. But then, for a brief second, static flickered through, followed distorted image, something pale, hollow-eyed, peering from behind the trees. Then the screen shut off again. Mara pulled herself up, her breath ragged. We can't just leave. We have proof. We know. Tito Ramon cut her off, his face a mask of fury and fear. Hindi nyo alam kung anong binubuksan nyo. Ang ibang kwento, hindi dapat inaalam. Louis swallowed hard. Pero Tito, kung aalis tayo, hindi natin malalaman ang totoo. Tito Ramon stepped closer, his voice low but firm. At kung manatili kayo, baka hindi na kayo makabalik. His words hung in the air, suffocating. Then, suddenly, the rustling stopped. The whispers faded. The forest was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that felt wrong, unnatural. As if something was waiting. Watching. Mara clutched her camera. Louis shifted uncomfortably. My own pulse was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then we saw it just past the clearing. In the distance where the trees began to thin, stood the village. Or at least what looked like one. Dimly lit huts, some with doors hanging open. Faint flickers of light like dying embers. The smell of something old, something decayed, drifted toward us. We found it, Luis whispered. But Tito Ramon's face darkened. Hindi kayo ang nakahanap sa baryo. He took a slow step back, gripping his amulet. Ang baryo ang nakahanap sa inyo. A shadow moved past one of the huts. Then another. They weren't walking. They were gliding. And then, one by one, the lights inside the village started to go out. Luis took a step forward, his breath shaky. Bakit parang hindi ito iniwan? His voice was barely above whisper. The village looked frozen in time, huts still standing, doors slightly ajar, as if the people inside had just stepped out and never returned. But there were no signs of life. No sound. No movement. Except for the shadows that had just passed. Mara raised her camera again, pressing the button, but the screen flickered uselessly. She muttered a curse under her breath. Dali, won't it work? She shook it, frustration mixing with fear. This is the proof we need. Tito Ramon grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. Huwag mong subukan. His voice was sharp, almost panicked. Kung may gusto silang ipakita sa'yo, makikita mo. Pero hindi sa gusto mong paraan. I felt chill creep up on my spine. What do you mean? Tito Ramon didn't answer. His gaze was locked onto the village, his knuckles white from gripping the small amulet around his neck. Luis exchanged a glance with me, unsure whether to push forward or run, but before anyone could decide, a sound rang through the air, light at first, almost delicate, like wind chimes. Then it grew louder. It wasn't chimes. It was laughter. Soft, distant, echoing from the huts. Child's laugh. Mara clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide. Luis instinctively took a step back. May bata, he asked, voice cracking. Tito Ramon shook his head slowly. Wala nang bata rito. The laughter faded, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than before. The lights in the village, those weak, flickering glows inside the huts, one by one, they started to vanish. First, the one closest to us. Then another. Then another. Something was coming. I swallowed the lump in my throat, whispering, we should go. Mara hesitated, her grip tightening around her useless camera. What if someone is really there? Luis exhaled sharply. Are you insane? You saw what we saw. But Mara took a slow step forward, toward the edge of the village. What if they need help? The moment she crossed the threshold, everything changed. The wind died instantly. The trees stopped swaying. The scent of damp earth turned into something fall, rotting, decayed. The village, once eerily quiet, now pulsed with an overwhelming sense of presence. And then, movement. From the corner of early eye, I saw a figure emerge from one of the huts. Not walking. Floating. It was thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted as if studying us. Her breath hitched. Mara, come back. She stood frozen, staring at the thing. Then, slowly, more figures stepped out from the shadows, each one with hollow eyes, their faces stretched in unnatural smiles. Luis stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. "Oh, and by God," he whispered. Tito Ramon stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket, a small pouch filled with dark powder. He muttered something under his breath and threw a handful into the air. It swirled unnaturally, as if caught in invisible currents. The figures paused. Then, without warning, they all turned their heads at the same time. Not toward Mara. Not toward Luis. Toward me. A wave of coldness washed over me, seeping into my bones. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt something press against my chest, not physically, but inside, as if something unseen had reached into me, gripping something deep within. "Magsara kayo ng mata," Tito Ramon ordered. "Huwag kayong tumingin." Luis immediately obeyed, squeezing his eyes shut. Mara hesitated, her hands trembling. But I couldn't move. Because the tallest figure, the one closest to me, was no longer floating. It was standing right in front of me. So close, I could see its mouth moving. No sound came out, but understood. It was whispering my name. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Still, I heard it clearly, as if the words had been placed directly into my head. It whispered my name again, stretching each syllable unnaturally. Nilwe's entire body felt like it was sinking into the ground, like something heavy had wrapped itself around me, pulling me down into the earth. Then, in an instant, everything snapped back. Tito Ramon's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Buksan mo ang kamay mo." I didn't even realize my fingers had curled into a tight fist. Slowly, I pried them open, and my stomach dropped. In the right palm was something cold and small, a stone, smooth and dark, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I had no idea how it got there. The moment I looked at it, the whispering grew louder. No longer just my name, but something else. Words I couldn't understand, but I felt them, crawling under my skin like insects. Luis yanked in the arm. "Itapon mo yan." I wanted to. I really did. But something in me refused. Tito Ramon grabbed my wrist, his grip firm. "Nakikita ka na nila. Kung hindi mo to ibabagsak, hindi ka na makakaalis." His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the desperation in them. Walang bumabalik na ganito. And my breath hitched. And my fingers twitched. But before I could decide, Mara screamed. The figures had moved closer. A lot closer. They no longer looked like shadowy forms in the distance. Now, I could see their faces, too stretched, too pale, their smiles wide but empty. They weren't floating anymore. They were walking. No, not walking. Gliding. Their feet barely touched the ground, and their bodies twitched with every unnatural step. The tallest one, the one that had whispered my name, reached out a long, thin arm. Its fingers bent in ways that shouldn't be possible, its nails black and cracked. Luis grabbed in the arm again. "Run!" But before any of us could move, the ground beneath us trembled. Deep, guttural sound rumbled through the air, vibrating in my chest. The huts in the village, those dark, lifeless structures, began to shift, their wooden walls creaking. Then, one by one, the doors swung open. Not slowly. Not gently. They slammed open all at once. Darkness spilled out from inside, thick like smoke, curling along the ground. And from within, more shapes began to emerge. More figures. Luis was already pulling me backward, but my body still felt too heavy, my fingers clenched tightly around the stone. Tito Ramon's voice cut through the chaos. Huwag kayong tatakbo pabalik. Lalalim tayo. Mara, still gasping, turned to him. Then where do we go? Tito Ramon's gaze snapped to the left, toward a narrow path winding deeper into the trees. His expression darkened. May isang daan pa. Luis didn't hesitate. He grabbed in my arm, practically dragging me along. CJ. Basta umalis tayo dito. But the figures, now too many to count, moved faster. Their whispering turned into something else. Not just words. Laughter. A sound that didn't belong here, didn't belong to anything human. And then the tallest one, the one closest to me, did something I hadn't expected. It tilted its head, and for the briefest moment, the wide, stretched smile faded. Its face twitched, its hollow eyes blinking as if recognizing something. Me. And then, for the first time, it spoke aloud. Matagal ka na naming hinihintay. The voice wasn't deep, wasn't growling or monstrous. It was soft. Familiar. Like mine. The moment the words left its lips, the stone in my palm burned ice cold. And my vision blurred. The world around me twisted, the dark smoke from the huts rising higher, swallowing everything in shadows. And then, wasn't there anymore? I couldn't feel the ground beneath me. The moment the figure spoke with a voice, everything around me twisted into something else. My vision blurred as if I had been submerged underwater. The village, the trees, even Luis, Mara, and Tito Ramon, everything stretched and melted into darkness. Then, silence. A heavy weight settled on my chest. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. It was like something was holding me in place, something cold and ancient. My breath came in short gasps as I forced myself to look around. I wasn't in the village anymore. I was inside the hut. The walls were made of woven bamboo, but they pulsed like they were alive, breathing. A single oil lamp flickered dimly, casting long, distorted shadows across the space. I turned in my head slowly, in my pulse hammering in my ears. And then I saw it in a mirror. But it wasn't just any mirror. It was old, the glass slightly warped, its surface rippling like water. And in it, I saw myself. But the reflection wasn't normal. It was me, but it wasn't. My eyes were hollow, dark pits. My lips were curled into that same unnatural smile as the figures outside. The moment I locked eyes with it, the reflection whispered again, its voice layered, overlapping with others. Matagal ka na naming hinihintay. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. Ano to? My voice cracked, but the reflection only tilted its head, watching me like prey. Then, behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I spun around just as the bamboo door creaked open. And there stood the figure, the tall one. The one that had whispered my name. Only now, I could see it fully. It looked like me. Exactly like me. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs would crack. It smiled wider, stepping forward. Hindi ka na makakatakas. Its voice was mine. I shook my head violently. Hindi ako ikaw. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't listen. The stone in my hand burned again, colder than before, its pulse sensing with a heartbeat. Then the figure raised its hand and I realized it was holding something. A stone. The same as mine. Noah's stomach twisted. This wasn't just some ghost, some spirit haunting the village. It was something worse. It was replacing me. I clenched in my jaw, forcing Noah's body to move. I couldn't let this happen. I wouldn't. With all the strength I had left, I gritted my teeth and threw the stone to the ground. The moment it left my hand, everything cracked. The hut shook violently, the mirror's surface shattering. The reflection of me inside twisted, its mouth stretching open in silent scream before dissolving into black mist. Then, the figure in front of me let out an ear-piercing shriek, its body contorting unnaturally. It reached for me, but its fingers crumbled into dust before they could touch me. The walls collapsed inward, and suddenly, I was falling. The next thing I knew, I was back in the forest. The air was thick with smoke. The village, the strange, cursed place, was no longer there. Just empty land, as if it had never existed. Luis and Mara were beside me, both gasping for breath. Tito Ramon was gripping his amulet so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Luis was the first to speak. Anong nangyari? Nawala lahat. I swallowed hard, my entire body shaking. Hindi ko alam. But deep inside, I did know. Something had tried to take me. To replace me. And it almost succeeded. Mara turned on her camera, pressing record, but the screen was blank. Just static. As if nothing had been captured at all. Tito Ramon exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Sabi ko sa inyo may mga kwentong hindi dapat binubuksan. I looked down at my hand, half expecting to see the stone still there. But it was gone. Or maybe, it was never there to begin with. Luis muttered under his breath. Hindi tayo babalik dito, di ba? None of us answered. Because deep down, we knew, some things don't stay buried forever. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, surrounded by the thick silence of the forest, the place where the village had once been now nothing more than empty land. The air felt lighter, as if whatever had been holding it in place was finally gone. But deep in our gut, I knew it wasn't that simple. Some things don't just disappear. Mara pressed her camera's power button over and over, frustration growing on her face. It won't turn on, she muttered. She checked the battery, even swapped out the memory card, but the screen remained blank. She exhaled sharply. All that proof gone. Luis let out a nervous laugh, though there was no humor in it. Maybe that's for the best. He wiped sweat off his forehead. You really wanna bring something like that back with us? I didn't answer. Eloy's finger still felt the ghost of the stone's weight in my palm, as if it had burned itself into my skin. Even though it was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me had stayed behind. Or worse, something had followed us. Tito Ramon was the first to move. Without a word, he turned and started walking. We didn't need to be told twice. We followed him, our footsteps hurried, as if we could outrun the memory of what had just happened. The hike back to town felt longer, like the forest had stretched itself, trying to keep us inside. Every shadow, every rustling leaf made my skin crawl. It wasn't until we saw the first sign of houses, real houses, with people, lights, and voices, that I finally let out a breath didn't know was holding. We had made it out. But just because we had left didn't mean the village was truly gone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the figures, the mirror, the reflection that wasn't me. I could still hear the whispering, distant but persistent. Matagal ka na naming hinihintay. The next morning, I woke up to find Tito Ramon sitting outside our lodging, staring at the horizon with a cigarette in his hand. He didn't look at me when he spoke. May mga lugar na hindi para sa atin, he said quietly. Minsan, mas mabuti nang hindi natin hinahanap ang sagot. I swallowed, sitting down beside him. Pero bakit? Ano talaga ang nangyari sa baryo? He finally turned to face me. Alam mo na ang sagot. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I didn't understand, that none of it made sense. But I couldn't. Because deep inside, I did know. That village wasn't abandoned. It wasn't lost. It had never left, it just existed on the edge of something else, something we weren't meant to see. And for some reason, it had tried to take me. Mara and Luis left later that afternoon, shaken but eager to put everything behind them. Mara was already making excuses, convincing herself that her camera malfunctioned, that maybe our minds had played tricks on us. Luis agreed, though I could tell he didn't believe it me. I wasn't sure what to believe. Before we parted ways, Tito Ramon handed me a small pouch. Ingatan mo to, he said. Kung sakali lang ni I didn't ask what was inside. Just took it. It's been months since we left Antique, but I still dream about that village. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I hear laughter outside a window. I check in my hands, expecting to see the stone. It's never there. But the weight of it never really left. And some nights, when everything is quiet, I swear hear it again. That voice. Whispering Ilay name.